There is an animal living in North America right now that can weigh 220 pounds, cover 40 feet in a single bound, drag prey 3 times its own body weight up a vertical rock face, and move through terrain that trained hunters with dogs struggle to navigate. It operates across a range that stretches from the Canadian Yukon to the southern tip of South America. It shares habitat with tens of millions of people across the western United States. It is the most widely distributed wildland mammal in the entire Western Hemisphere. And in the 400-plus years of recorded colonial and post-colonial history on this continent, it has killed fewer than 30 people. That number is not a typo, and it is not a misprint. It is not the number for a single year or a single decade. It is the cumulative total across the entire documented record. Fewer than 30 human fatalities across 4 centuries of coexistence between a large, capable, highly intelligent apex predator and the most habitat-altering species on the planet. The rarity is so extreme that it sits outside normal frameworks for thinking about dangerous animals. Domestic dogs kill more Americans in a single average year than mountain lions have killed in the entire history of North American record-keeping. Deer kill more people annually through vehicle collisions than mountain lions have killed in 4 centuries of direct predatory encounters. The numbers are not close. They are not even in the same order of magnitude. If you find that remarkable, you should. Because understanding why it is true requires understanding something genuinely unusual about the mountain lion, something that distinguishes it from every other apex predator sharing this continent, and something that the standard explanation of low encounter rates does not come close to capturing. It is not that mountain lions rarely encounter humans. In many parts of the American West, they encounter humans constantly. It is that they have made, with extraordinary and almost universal consistency across their entire range and across the entire span of recorded history, a behavioral choice that no other large predator on the continent makes with anything approaching the same reliability. They choose not to be seen. If you are interested in the real science behind how animals like this actually work and what is actually happening to the landscapes they inhabit, stay with this, because we are going to get into the full picture of why that choice exists, what it means biologically, and why the conditions that have sustained it for centuries are now, quietly and in specific places, beginning to change. The mountain lion goes by more common names than any other mammal in North America: puma, cougar, panther, catamount, ghost cat, painter. That last one is a corruption of panther from the Appalachian dialect tradition, and ghost cat is the informal name that field biologists sometimes use with a mix of professional affection and genuine frustration, because the behavioral reality it describes is not a folksy exaggeration. Mountain lions are almost pathologically difficult to observe in the wild under natural conditions. Biologists who study them professionally, with GPS collar data and camera trap networks and decades of field experience, will tell you that they have spent careers tracking individual animals whose locations they know to the nearest 100 meters, and still go months without a direct visual sighting. The animal knows where you are before you know it is anywhere near you. It has already made a decision about whether to remain visible or not by the time you have any awareness that the decision is being made. This is not incidental to the mountain lion's ecology. It is central to it, and it is the starting point for understanding why an animal this capable, this physically powerful, and this pervasively distributed across human-occupied terrain has produced such a vanishingly small human fatality record. The lion's invisibility is not just a hunting strategy. It is a comprehensive behavioral orientation toward the world that governs how it moves, where it rests, when it travels, and how it processes the presence of other large animals, including humans, in its territory. The mountain lion does not merely hunt from ambush. It lives from ambush. The concealment imperative that makes it a supremely effective predator also makes it one of the most behaviorally conflict-averse large carnivores on Earth. Understanding where that behavioral orientation comes from requires going back into the evolutionary history of the species, which is older and stranger than most people appreciate. Mountain lions belong to the genus Puma, which diverged from the lineage that produced the cheetah roughly 5 million years ago. The North American continent, during the Pleistocene, was not the predator-sparse landscape it is today. It was an ecosystem with multiple large carnivore lineages competing for the same prey base, including the American lion, which was the largest lion that ever lived, and was not the same animal as the modern mountain lion, the saber-toothed cat Smilodon, the short-faced bear, the dire wolf, and the early ancestors of the modern gray wolf. The mountain lion survived the Pleistocene extinction event that eliminated most of those competitors. Its relatives in North America did not. The modern mountain lion is, in part, a product of the selection pressures imposed by living in a continent full of larger, more powerful, and more socially organized predators. An animal that survived that competitive environment did so partly by being very good at not being seen by things that could kill it. The ghost cat behavioral profile is, in this reading, an ancient survival strategy adapted from a time when the mountain lion was not the apex predator of its continent, but rather a mid-tier carnivore trying to hold its own in an ecosystem stacked with things that outweighed and could outcompete it. The wolves that dominated the Pleistocene in North America, the dire wolves that traveled in large packs and could dominate carcasses through sheer social coordination, were the ecological analog of the wolf packs that modern mountain lions still reflexively avoid today. A mountain lion's response to wolves is not learned in the lifetime of an individual animal. It is an evolved behavioral disposition. When wolves recolonized Yellowstone and the surrounding landscape after their reintroduction in 1995, mountain lion behavior in those areas shifted measurably and quickly. The lions began using terrain differently. They hunted in areas with more cover and more escape routes. They abandoned kill sites more readily. They moved more at night, relative to dawn and dusk. The behavioral flexibility with which they responded to the wolves' return was not the expression of individual learning alone. It was the rapid behavioral unpacking of an ancient and deeply encoded disposition toward concealment and conflict avoidance in the presence of a social carnivore that had been absent from the landscape for 7 decades. The behavioral parallel with human encounters is not exact, but it is real. Humans are, in the ecological vocabulary that mountain lions operate in, a social, bipedal, large-bodied, loud, and unpredictable presence in the landscape. They arrive in groups. They make constant noise. They do not move like prey. They move like something that warrants avoidance and watchful monitoring from a distance rather than engagement. The mountain lion's default response to humans, the response that has produced the extraordinary rarity of attacks over 4 centuries, is an extension of the same evolved disposition toward concealment and conflict avoidance that made it a survivor in the Pleistocene and continues to make it a ghost in the landscapes it inhabits today. It is not that mountain lions are afraid of humans in the way a prey animal is afraid of a predator. It is that humans activate a behavioral response in mountain lions that is closer to the response produced by a rival or a potential threat than to the response produced by prey. The lion watches. It maintains distance. It declines to reveal itself. It waits to see what the intrusion means before deciding whether to act. When it acts on that watchful waiting by withdrawing entirely, which is what happens in the overwhelming majority of documented mountain lion encounters with humans, the human never knows the encounter occurred. This is the central fact of the mountain lion-human relationship that is almost impossible to fully internalize, even after you understand it intellectually. The encounters you know about are a tiny fraction of the encounters that occur. Trail cameras and GPS collar data from lions moving through areas with high human recreational use have made this concrete in recent decades in a way it never was before. A mountain lion will monitor a trail used by hundreds of hikers and runners, observe dozens of individuals passing within 100 yards, and produce no sign of its presence that any of those individuals would detect. It is watching. It is processing. It is making continuous low-level assessments of everything that moves through its territory. And it is, with overwhelming consistency, choosing not to engage. The trail camera record from areas like the Santa Cruz Mountains, the Cascades, and the Southern Rockies is full of nighttime footage of mountain lions moving along trails that were used by recreational hikers and runners hours before and would be used again hours later. The lions know the trails are used. The trails are highways of scent information that tell the lion exactly when and how often human traffic occurred and what it smelled like. The lion uses the same corridors humans use, but on a time-shifted schedule that minimizes contact. It is not a coincidence. It is a continuous, active behavioral management of proximity to humans that represents one of the most sophisticated ecological accommodations of human presence made by any large wild predator on Earth. The mechanism that makes this possible is the mountain lion's extraordinary sensory system, combined with a spatial intelligence that field biologists have spent decades struggling to fully characterize. Mountain lions have vision that works across an extraordinary range of light conditions. They can operate effectively at light levels that render human vision essentially useless. Their hearing is among the most sensitive of any North American mammal and is specifically calibrated to detect the sounds of large-bodied animals moving through terrain. Their olfactory system is less emphasized in popular accounts of the species than it is in the scientific literature, partly because wolves and bears are more commonly framed as nose-first hunters. But the mountain lion's sense of smell is acute and is used continuously in territory monitoring, prey tracking, and the assessment of conspecific and non-prey intruder presence. The combination of these sensory systems means that a mountain lion in its territory is receiving a continuous, multi-channel information stream about everything significant moving through its range. It knows where humans are in the landscape with a precision that humans can almost never reciprocate. The asymmetry of awareness is the foundation of the ghost cat phenomenon. The lion is not invisible because humans cannot see well. It is invisible because it knows where you are and where you are not, and it arranges itself accordingly. Camera trap research has produced data that makes this asymmetry vivid in a specific way. In studies where camera arrays are deployed at sufficient density to capture movement patterns of both mountain lions and recreationists in the same terrain, the lions demonstrate what researchers have described as a detour behavior around areas of high human activity, adjusting their routes on a nightly or even hourly basis based on the most recent scent and sound information about human presence. The detours are not dramatic avoidances of entire drainages or ridgelines. They are precise, minimal adjustments that take the lion around specific areas of current human use while keeping it within its normal movement corridor. The behavioral sophistication required to do this in real time, processing continuous sensory input and modifying movement decisions accordingly, is indicative of a cognitive capacity that popular accounts of mountain lion behavior typically understate. This is not a simple stimulus response machine. It is an animal running a continuous, dynamic model of its territory and the things moving through it, and making calculated decisions about how to position itself relative to those things. The default output of that model, when the things moving through the territory are humans, is avoidance. The question of what happens when that default output fails, when the calculation produces a different result, is where the science gets both more specific and more disturbing. And it requires understanding something about how mountain lion predatory behavior actually works, at the level of the nervous system and the perceptual system, rather than at the level of folk intuition about animal behavior. Mountain lions are obligate carnivores that have been selected by evolution to hunt specific types of prey using a specific predatory sequence. The sequence has discrete phases. There is a detection phase, in which the lion identifies a potential prey animal. There is an assessment phase, in which the lion evaluates the prey against criteria including size, behavioral state, apparent vulnerability, and the risk-cost calculation of an attack attempt. There is a stalking phase, in which the lion reduces the distance to the prey animal while remaining concealed. There is a final rush, covering typically 20 to 30 feet, that is concluded in the first 1 to 3 seconds of contact with a bite directed at the base of the skull or the back of the neck, designed to sever the spinal cord or suffocate the prey. The entire sequence from detection to completed kill is deeply encoded in the mountain lion's neurology and is driven by specific perceptual triggers that activate and sustain the sequential phases. The most powerful of these triggers are movement pattern, size, and behavioral cues associated with vulnerability. Mountain lion prey recognition is not a simple size filter. It is a multi-feature template that integrates size with the specific movement qualities of ungulate prey, the gait, the rhythm, the direction and speed of travel, and with the behavioral signals that indicate whether a specific individual is isolated, injured, young, or otherwise vulnerable relative to the average member of its species. The template has been built by evolutionary history and refined by the individual lion's own experience hunting specific prey in specific terrain. It is not infinitely flexible. There are things it will and will not process as prey, and those limits are what make the mountain lion's relationship with humans so different from its relationship with deer or elk. An adult human, walking upright at normal speed, producing the sounds and smells of a human, triggers the mountain lion's assessment system in a way that activates monitoring rather than predatory sequencing. The behavioral signals do not match the prey template. The size is in range, but the movement is wrong. The smell is wrong. The sounds are wrong. Most critically, the behavioral response to detection is wrong. A deer that detects a mountain lion freezes, then bolts. A human who detects a mountain lion typically stops, faces the animal, and produces a sustained visual and auditory signal of alert, assertive, non-fleeing presence. From the mountain lion's nervous system's perspective, this is not prey behavior. It is something else entirely, something whose categorization produces watchful hesitation, rather than the neural cascade that initiates the stalking phase. This is the biological basis for the behavioral guidance that wildlife agencies have issued and that has been independently validated by the encounter record. The guidance is not arbitrary. It is the reverse engineering of the mountain lion's predatory decision-making system from the observed outcomes of thousands of encounters. It works because it targets the perceptual triggers that initiate and sustain the predatory sequence. By standing tall, facing the animal, maintaining direct eye contact, making noise, and if necessary, throwing objects, a human is producing a sustained stream of signals that do not match the prey template and that activate the avoidance response rather than the predatory response. The mountain lion does not decide that the human is too dangerous to attack in the way a human might consciously weigh risks. The behavioral machinery that would initiate an attack is not being activated in the first place because the input signals are wrong. The system is being short-circuited at the perceptual level rather than overridden at a higher cognitive level. The running response is the single most dangerous thing a human can do in a mountain lion encounter, and understanding exactly why requires going one level deeper into the neurology of predatory behavior. The visual system of a carnivore that hunts by ambush is highly calibrated to detect and respond to the motion of fleeing prey. The visual cortex has specific circuits that are activated by the motion pattern of a running quadruped or a small, fast-moving target. These circuits do not wait for a full cognitive assessment of what they are seeing before initiating the chase response. They activate rapidly, in a time frame measured in fractions of a second rather than seconds, and they produce a strong neural drive toward pursuit that can overcome the inhibitory signals produced by the assessment phase's identification of the target as something anomalous. This is sometimes described informally as the predator's eye, the reflexive capture of attention and the initiation of chase behavior by a fleeing target, and it is present in virtually every large carnivore that has been studied in sufficient detail to characterize it. When a human runs from a mountain lion, they are activating this system. The chase response can initiate even if the lion's prior assessment of the human was not producing predatory sequencing. The running human has provided a sufficiently strong, fast-moving, fleeing target signal to override the anomalous readings from the other sensory channels. The neural machinery does not carefully distinguish between a running deer and a running human in the first fractions of a second of response. It initiates pursuit, and once the mountain lion is in active pursuit, the subsequent phases of the predatory sequence can cascade with a speed that makes behavioral correction by the human very difficult. The lion is now committed to a motor program that is not easily interrupted. This is why the encounter record shows such a consistent and stark association between running behavior by humans and escalation of mountain lion encounters to contact or attack. It is not that running communicates weakness in some vague social sense. It is that running activates specific neural hardware in the mountain lion that is very difficult to turn off once it has been turned on. The full predatory sequence, once initiated, is extraordinarily fast and difficult to survive without a prior behavioral decision to resist actively. Mountain lion attacks are not prolonged struggles. They are brief, violent, and decisive. The lion's killing technique, refined by millions of years of selection for efficiency, is aimed at the back of the skull and neck, with the canines penetrating to the spinal column or the brainstem when the attack is optimally executed. Death in prey species occurs within seconds to minutes, typically from spinal cord injury, brainstem compression, or suffocation from throat compression. The size and strength of a mountain lion is not well represented by its weight alone. A 200-pound mountain lion is not analogous to a 200-pound human. The muscle architecture, the leverage of the limbs relative to the body, the jaw-closing force, and the hardened, retractable claws designed to grip and hold struggling prey combine to produce an animal whose offensive capability greatly exceeds what its weight class suggests to anyone assessing it through the lens of human physical intuition. Humans who have survived mountain lion attacks have survived because they fought back, specifically because they targeted the lion's face, eyes, and throat, which are the areas of vulnerability for an animal locked in a struggle with a human who has not been rendered immediately incapacitated by the initial strike. The documented survivors are not people who were physically exceptional or larger than average. They are people who were not immobilized by the initial attack and who responded immediately with aggressive, targeted counterattack directed at the animal's most sensitive areas. Children are disproportionately represented in fatalities, partly because the initial attack is more likely to be immediately incapacitating relative to their smaller body size, and partly because the behavioral response of effective resistance is less accessible to a young child in the physiological and psychological state produced by the first seconds of an attack. The pattern in the fatality and serious injury record is not random, and studying it carefully tells you a great deal about the conditions under which the mountain lion's default avoidance behavior fails. The victims are overwhelmingly individuals who were alone. They are frequently moving at speed on trails in crepuscular light conditions. They are disproportionately either children or adults who for some reason behaved in a way that activated the prey template rather than inhibiting it. The lions involved are disproportionately juveniles, subadults, dispersing from their natal range who have not yet fully calibrated their prey preferences through successful adult hunting experience, or adults showing signs of nutritional stress, or animals that have been documented in human-adjacent environments long enough that their baseline wariness has been substantially reduced. These are not 7 different explanations for 7 different attacks. They are a set of interacting variables that cluster together in the attack record with a consistency that points to a single underlying mechanism. The mountain lion's default avoidance behavior is robust across the vast majority of conditions and individuals. The conditions under which it fails are specific. They are not common, but they are becoming more common. The growth of mountain lion populations across the western United States since the 1970s is the most important demographic backdrop for the current conversation about human mountain lion coexistence. The transition from bounty-based killing programs to regulated management that occurred across most western states during the 1960s and 1970s removed the sustained mortality pressure that had been suppressing mountain lion numbers across the previous century. Populations rebounded. Range expanded. The species recolonized terrain from which it had been largely absent and began to appear at the edges of human development in ways that earlier generations of Western residents had not experienced. California's 1990 ban on sport hunting accelerated this process in the state with the most extensive human development overlapping mountain lion habitat. The population growth that followed the ban was real and was the intended conservation outcome of the policy. Its secondary effects on human-wildlife conflict rates have been the subject of more politically fraught discussion. The statewide mountain lion population in California is not easily estimated with precision because mountain lions do not aggregate in ways that allow direct counting, and their cryptic behavior makes population survey methods that work for other species less reliable. The consensus estimate of 4,000 to 6,000 animals represents the integration of multiple indirect methods, including prey-based modeling, territory size estimates from GPS collar data, and occupancy modeling from camera trap surveys. The uncertainty bounds around that estimate are wide. What is not in serious scientific dispute is that the population is larger than it was in 1990, that it has expanded its distribution into areas of the coastal ranges and foothills that were not regularly occupied before the hunting ban, and that the human-wildlife overlap in those areas has increased accordingly. The incidents that have resulted from this overlap, specifically the attacks and close encounters documented since 1990 in California, reflect a population that is navigating a landscape unlike anything its evolutionary history prepared it for. The challenge is not simply one of coexistence at the interface of wild and developed land. It is one of living in a landscape where the wild and the developed are so intimately interspersed that the interface is everywhere and nowhere, a mosaic of residential development, agricultural land, open space preserves, utility corridors, and remnant natural vegetation, that a mountain lion moving through a coastal range county traverses continuously in the course of normal daily activity. There is no clean line between mountain lion habitat and human habitat in San Diego County, in Marin County, in the Santa Clara Valley. There are gradients and patches and corridors, and the animals that have been living and reproducing in those landscapes for the past 3 decades have been learning those gradients and patches and corridors in intimate detail. The learning is the point. Mountain lions are highly intelligent animals with excellent spatial memory and substantial individual learning capacity. A mountain lion that establishes a home range in a suburban interface landscape in its first or second year of life and spends the subsequent decade moving through that landscape is not the same animal, behaviorally, as a mountain lion that has spent its life in remote wilderness terrain with minimal human contact. It has learned where humans concentrate and when. It has learned which areas of human activity are safe to avoid and which are safe to traverse. It has learned which human structures contain accessible prey, specifically domestic animals, and which do not. It has learned, through the complete absence of negative consequences from hundreds of exposures, that humans are not dangerous. That last piece of learning is the one that matters most to the question of attack risk, because the learned safety of humans is not stable at the same level across all individuals or all conditions. It is a probability distribution with a long tail, and the tail represents the small fraction of interactions in which the combination of an extensively habituated animal, a prey mimicking human behavioral profile, and environmental conditions that favor predatory activation produces an attack. The corridor problem is one of the most consequential but least publicly visible dimensions of the human mountain-lion relationship as it is currently configured in the American West. Mountain lions are territorial animals with large home ranges. Adult male mountain lions in the southern Rockies maintain ranges of 100 to 300 square miles. Adult females have smaller but still substantial ranges. The territorial structure of a mountain lion population requires continuous dispersal of juveniles from natal ranges to establish new territories, and that dispersal in historically intact mountain lion habitat occurred across landscape-scale movements that sometimes covered hundreds of miles. In the fragmented landscape of the modern American West, those dispersal movements increasingly require crossing infrastructure that was not designed with wildlife movement in mind, and that kills mountain lions at rates sufficient to affect local population dynamics. The Interstate 15 corridor in Southern California, the Interstate 280 corridor in the San Francisco Bay Area, the Highway 17 connection between the Santa Cruz and Santa Clara Valley populations. These are not merely inconveniences for dispersing mountain lions. They are demographic filters that determine which individuals survive long enough to establish territories and reproduce. The individuals that do not make successful crossings, which is the majority, either die attempting the crossing or are turned back into the habitat they came from. Turned back dispersers are young males in a hormonally driven dispersal state, nutritionally stressed from the energetic cost of travel, and now competing for hunting territory in landscapes they cannot leave. They are the demographic profile most overrepresented in attack incidents. They are not randomly distributed across the landscape. They are concentrated in the places where the corridors are most restricted, which are also frequently the places where the corridors intersect most intensively with human recreational land use. The wildlife crossing conversation has moved from the theoretical to the practical in a handful of high-profile locations over the past decade, and the science supporting the investment in crossing infrastructure is substantially more robust than the public discourse around it typically suggests. The primary documented benefit of wildlife crossings in mountain lion habitat is genetic exchange between populations separated by traffic barriers, which counteracts the inbreeding depression that isolated populations accumulate over generations. Secondary benefits include the reduction of direct traffic mortality, which in the Santa Ana Mountains population has been identified as one of the primary causes of adult mortality, alongside intraspecific conflict. The tertiary benefit, the one most relevant to the human safety dimensions of this conversation, is the reduction of demographic pressure on the young male cohort in isolated populations. When young males can disperse successfully, they are not compressed into human-adjacent terrain by the inability to move outward. The pathway through which demographic pressure translates into elevated attack risk is not a direct one, but the correlation between isolated population dynamics and elevated human encounter incident rates is visible in the data from the most studied populations. The prey-based dynamics operating alongside the population and corridor picture deserve specific attention because they represent the demand side of the equation that habitat and corridor infrastructure address from the supply side. Mountain lions require large amounts of prey biomass to sustain themselves. An adult male mountain lion kills, depending on the prey species, one large ungulate every 7 to 10 days on average. A female with cubs kills at substantially higher rates to meet the combined energy demands of herself and her offspring. The prey base that sustains these kill rates in the areas of highest human-wildlife overlap is frequently under stress from the same land use changes that are compressing mountain lion habitat. Urban development removes deer habitat. Agricultural conversion reduces the shrublands and forest edges where deer concentrate. Recreational disturbance alters deer movement patterns. Drought reduces the vegetation productivity that deer populations depend on, reducing carrying capacity. The periodic crashes in deer populations associated with severe drought years in California and the Southwest have been followed, with measurable consistency, by spikes in mountain lion encounters with humans and domestic animals. The mechanism is straightforward. When deer are scarce, lions hunt harder, range wider, and are more likely to pursue opportunities that a well-fed animal would bypass. The hungry mountain lion is not a different animal from the replete mountain lion. It is the same animal operating with a recalibrated risk tolerance that accepts higher costs in pursuit of the next caloric intake. Nutritional stress does not cause mountain lions to decide to hunt humans. That framing is too anthropomorphic and too simple. What it does is lower the threshold at which the assessment phase of the predatory sequence, the phase in which the lion weighs the risk of an attack against the expected caloric return, reaches the activation threshold. The anomalous features of a human target that normally produce assessment, hesitation, and avoidance behavior are weighted differently when the lion's physiological state is registering urgent, energetic deficit. The cost-benefit calculation that normally resolves clearly on the side of avoidance shifts toward a more equivocal result. The human target looks more like something worth investigating more closely than passing by. The investigation, at close range, by an animal in a state of elevated predatory drive, is the configuration that produces the incidents in which a lion follows a trail runner for an extended distance without attacking, or approaches a dog walker at close range in daylight, or enters a residential yard after nightfall to investigate the source of sounds associated with small animals. None of those incidents are attacks. Each of them represents a point on a behavioral continuum, and the end of that continuum, the point at which the investigation transitions to an initiated predatory sequence, is closer than it normally is when the animal is nutritionally stressed. The domestic animal problem sits at the intersection of habituation and nutritional stress in a way that makes it both a welfare concern for pet owners and a leading indicator of elevated attack risk in a specific area. Mountain lions that begin taking domestic prey, primarily horses, goats, llamas, sheep, and dogs, have crossed a threshold of proximity to human structures that wild-conditioned animals typically maintain. The taking of domestic prey in itself is not evidence of predatory interest in humans. Mountain lions that prey on livestock and domestic animals can do so for extended periods, sometimes years, without any involvement of human beings as prey targets. The cases in the historical record where domestic prey-taking preceded a human attack are a minority of all cases of domestic prey-taking, but they represent a systematic skew in the data that is not explainable by chance. Animals that are taking domestic prey are, by definition, operating in close proximity to humans and human structures. They are doing so without negative consequences. They are building a behavioral record of human-adjacent activity that correlates with reduced wariness. They are the animals most likely, under conditions of acute nutritional stress or crepuscular encounter with a prey-mimic human, to have the predatory sequence initiate in a context where a human is present. The pattern of domestic prey-taking before human attacks, in a subset of documented cases, has led some wildlife biologists to argue for more proactive management intervention when domestic prey incidents are reported in areas with high concentrations of recreational human users. The argument is that domestic prey taking is a legible behavioral signal that a specific animal has crossed a habituation threshold that warrants active management attention, even if no human attack has occurred. The counter-argument from conservation-oriented stakeholders is that lethal removal of every mountain lion that takes domestic prey would represent an unacceptable level of take from populations that are not large enough to sustain it, and would effectively punish animals for living in landscapes that human development has left them no good alternative to. The tension between these positions is real, and is not resolved by a simple appeal to either human safety or conservation interests. It requires a landscape-level management framework that addresses the conditions producing the behavior, rather than simply removing the individuals exhibiting it. That framework does not currently exist in a mature form in any American West jurisdiction. The low-light encounter pattern is one of the least appreciated risk factors in the public conversation about mountain lion attacks, and one of the most consistent features of the documented attack record. The crepuscular and nocturnal activity patterns of mountain lions are not preferences or tendencies. They are deeply encoded behavioral adaptations that reflect the lion's evolutionary history as an ambush predator in landscapes where visibility is a key determinant of hunting success. Mountain lions are most active in the hour before and after sunrise, and in the hour before and after sunset, and they maintain substantial activity levels through the night in areas where they are habituated to moving in low light. The dawn and dusk windows are the windows of highest hunting activity, most direct predatory drive, and highest probability of the lion operating in a state of elevated perceptual sensitivity to prey-mimic signals. A trail runner moving through known mountain lion territory in the pre-dawn light is moving through that territory during the window of maximum mountain lion predatory activity. They are producing a motion pattern, speed, and sound signature that activates chase responses more readily than the same person walking at midday. The low-light conditions reduce the human's sensory detection capability far more than they reduce the mountain lion's, amplifying the asymmetry of awareness that already characterizes the relationship. The lion can see the runner cannot see the lion. The lion is in its peak activity window. The runner is providing a motion pattern optimized for activating pursuit responses. The encounter odds are systematically elevated relative to any other combination of time and human behavior in the same terrain. This does not mean that running trails at dawn is foolish, or that the risk is substantial in absolute terms. It means that the risk is meaningfully elevated relative to baseline, and that people making choices about when and how to use mountain lion habitat should understand what the combination of factors they are choosing actually represents. The group size effect on mountain lion encounter outcomes is the clearest and most actionable finding in the entire encounter dataset, and it is not communicated with the emphasis it deserves in most public guidance documents. The analysis of documented mountain lion encounters across multiple decades and jurisdictions shows a relationship between group size and predatory encounter outcomes that is striking in its clarity. Solitary individuals are dramatically overrepresented in predatory encounters and in the incident subset that escalated to attack. Groups of 2 or more show a substantially lower predatory encounter rate. Groups of 3 or more show a further reduction. The effect is not linear, and the diminishing returns appear to set in fairly quickly, meaning that a group of 6 is not meaningfully safer than a group of 3 in the same terrain. But the difference between 1 and 2, and between 2 and 3, is substantial and consistent across the record. The mechanism is straightforward in principle, but has multiple components in practice. A group of humans is louder and detectable from a greater distance, which increases the probability that the lion detects the group in time to exercise its default avoidance behavior before close-range contact occurs. A group of humans presents a visually confusing and behaviorally unpredictable social unit that does not map cleanly onto the lone prey template that predatory sequencing is calibrated for. A group of humans presents multiple points of potential retaliation, which dramatically elevates the cost side of the attack risk calculation. The lion's assessment phase, which would produce a brief hesitation before avoidance in a solo encounter, produces a more decisive and faster avoidance response in a group encounter because the risk signals are not ambiguous. The group is clearly not prey. The group is something to avoid. The practical implication for anyone recreating in mountain lion habitat is simple and has been stated in various forms in wildlife agency literature for decades. Travel with other people when you are in mountain lion habitat. The specific implication that is less commonly stated with equal directness is that the protective effect of a companion requires that the companion actually be present, walking or moving with you rather than significantly separated. Trail running groups that have gaps of a quarter mile or more between runners are not providing meaningful group protection to the individuals at the front or the back of the spread. The companion needs to be close enough to provide the multi-person visual and auditory signal that changes the encounter dynamic. A solo runner, who is technically part of a group that is strung out across 2 miles of trail, is, from the mountain lion's perspective, a solo runner. The statistical rarity of mountain lion attacks is both a genuine biological fact and, in its typical deployment in public communications, a source of a specific kind of misleading framing. The framing typically invites a comparison between the probability of a mountain lion attack and the probability of other risks that are accepted as part of normal life. The lightning strike comparison, the domestic dog comparison, the bathtub drowning comparison. These comparisons are statistically valid, and they do provide important perspective. They do not, however, address the question that actually determines how much attention a risk warrants from the perspective of an individual making behavioral choices in the terrain where that risk is present. The question is not how this risk compares to other causes of mortality in the population as a whole. The question is how the risk changes as a function of specific behavioral choices that the individual actually controls. The probability of a mountain lion fatality for a specific individual is astronomically low if that individual never goes into mountain lion habitat, moderately low if they go into mountain lion habitat in groups during daylight hours, slightly less low if they go into mountain lion habitat alone during daylight hours, measurably less low if they run alone in mountain lion habitat at dawn or dusk, and meaningfully elevated if they run alone in mountain lion habitat at dawn or dusk in an area with a documented pattern of human encounter incidents involving habituated lions. The absolute risk at even the highest risk end of that spectrum remains very small. But the variation across the spectrum is real. It is large in relative terms, and it is entirely determined by behavioral choices that the individual controls. Communicating risk in terms of the population-level baseline ignores this variation and leaves the individuals who are making the highest risk behavioral choices without the information they need to understand what those choices actually mean. The honest conversation about mountain lion risk in the current period requires acknowledging 3 things simultaneously. It requires acknowledging the genuine rarity of attacks, which is not a public relations construct, but a real biological fact that reflects the lion's evolved behavioral disposition toward conflict avoidance. It requires acknowledging that the conditions producing that rarity are not static, and that specific, identifiable changes in the landscape are modifying the encounter risk profile in specific areas and for specific populations of human users. And it requires acknowledging that the behavioral choices of individual humans in mountain lion habitat make a measurable difference to their own risk level in ways that population-level statistics cannot capture or communicate. The wildlife agencies responsible for managing mountain lion populations and communicating about mountain lion risk have been navigating a genuinely difficult communication challenge. The history of public fear responses to large carnivores in North America is not a history of calibrated, evidence-based concern. It is a history of disproportionate and often ecologically destructive fear responses that have driven beneficial species to local or regional extinction, produced bounty systems that decimated populations that had existed for millennia, and generated political pressures that have repeatedly overridden sound wildlife management. Wildlife managers are legitimately concerned that honest communication about the direction of the trend in mountain lion encounter incidents will activate the same irrational fear responses and produce pressures for lethal management programs that would harm a species whose conservation status and ecological function are important and not currently adequately protected across its full range. That concern is not cynical. It reflects a real and documented history. But the communication strategy of emphasizing extreme rarity without context has costs of its own. It leaves recreationists making behavioral choices in mountain lion habitat without accurate information about the risk-relevant dimensions of those choices. It leaves parents of young children in mountain lion interface communities without clear guidance about the specific vulnerability of small children in those environments. It creates a gap between the official picture and the emerging picture visible in incident data that erodes public trust when incidents occur. And it fails to build the public understanding of mountain lion ecology and behavior that would allow people to make genuinely informed choices about coexistence, choices that are more sustainable for both humans and mountain lions than either reflexive fear or reflexive reassurance. The mountain lion has survived in North America through a combination of biological capability and behavioral discretion that is genuinely remarkable. It is the only apex predator on the continent that has consistently chosen to remain invisible, to manage its proximity to the most habitat-altering species in its range, rather than engaging with it, to find the edge of human presence and stay on the other side of it. That behavioral choice, encoded in its evolutionary history and expressed in the daily movement decisions of every individual lion in every landscape it inhabits, is the primary reason that coexistence between mountain lions and humans has been possible at all in a landscape as transformed by human activity as the contemporary American West. It is the reason for the number that started this discussion: fewer than 30 human fatalities in 4 centuries, in a continent full of people and full of mountain lions. That number is the product of the ghost cat's decision to be a ghost. The conditions that have sustained that decision, the intact prey bases, the functional dispersal corridors, the undisturbed wild terrain that gives the lion the behavioral room it needs to manage its own proximity to humans on its own terms, are eroding in specific places at specific rates. The signal is in the data. The signal is not a crisis, it is a trend, and trends have directions. The direction of this one, in the places where the erosion is most advanced, is toward more encounters, more incidents, and more of the specific kind of incident, close range,